The road trip had been Tom's idea. He had pitched it as a chance to break free from their stifling routines. A few days of open roads, cheap motels, and no responsibilities. Alyssa, Mark, and Jenna had reluctantly agreed, eager for any distraction from the endless grind of their small-town lives. The four of them had been friends since high school, but adulthood had pulled them in different directions. The trip was supposed to rekindle something, a spark that had grown dim over the years. By the third day, their enthusiasm was waning. The forested backroads they were driving seemed endless, and their conversations had grown sparse. Even the music on the car radio failed to lift their spirits. Mark, ever the joker, had taken to pointing out every dilapidated barn and rusted mailbox they passed, dubbing them local attractions. Jenna, who had taken the front passenger seat, responded with increasingly sarcastic remarks. Alyssa, sitting in the back with Tom, stared out the window, her mind wandering. It was Alyssa who first spotted the town. A thin mist rolled across the forest floor as the road curved, revealing the clustered rooftops of Ashwick. A town, she muttered, her voice breaking the monotony. Maybe we can stop here? Tom, who had been driving for hours, nodded eagerly. Thank God. My legs are cramping. Ashwick looked like something out of a postcard. Quaint cobblestone streets, ivy-covered brick buildings, and lampposts that flickered faintly in the late afternoon gloom. But it was eerily quiet. There were no cars, no pedestrians, no sound at all except the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt as though the town had been frozen in time, waiting for something or someone to bring it back to life. They parked in the town square, stepping out into the chilly air. The silence pressed down on them like a weight, and for a moment, none of them spoke. It was Mark who broke the spell, gesturing toward a nearby building with exaggerated flair. Ladies and gentlemen, behold, the Ashwick Museum of Curiosities. The museum stood out from the other buildings, its polished stone facade gleaming in stark contrast to the weathered bricks around it. Large brass letters spelled out its name above a pair of imposing double doors. Alyssa frowned. This place looks too new. Maybe they just take good care of it, Tom offered, though he sounded uncertain. Jenna tilted her head, peering at the building. I don't remember seeing this on the map. Did anyone mention a museum? Mark shrugged. Who cares? It looks interesting. Let's check it out. The doors creaked loudly as they entered, the sound echoing through the cavernous lobby. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and carried a faint metallic tang, like old coins. Polished wooden floors gleamed under the light of intricate chandeliers, and the walls were lined with velvet curtains in deep crimson hues. At the far end of the room stood a reception desk, behind which sat a man who looked like he'd stepped out of another century. He was tall and thin, his pale skin stretched tightly over angular features. His dark suit was immaculate, and his black hair was slicked back with precision. When he smiled, his teeth seemed too sharp, too white. Welcome, he said, his voice low and smooth. You are most fortunate. The Ashwick Museum is rarely open to the public. Alyssa's unease deepened. She glanced at the others, but they seemed captivated by the man. Tom stepped forward, extending a hand. Thanks for having us. This place looks incredible. The man did not take his hand. Instead, he gestured toward the hallway that led deeper into the museum. Please follow me. The artifacts are eager to meet you. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down Alyssa's spine, but she said nothing as they followed him into the first gallery. The room was dimly lit, the displays illuminated by small spotlights that cast long shadows across the floor. Each artifact was encased in glass, accompanied by a brass placard describing its origin and history. The objects themselves were strange, ordinary at first glance, but unsettling upon closer inspection. There was a porcelain doll with cracked skin and empty eye sockets. The placard claimed it had belonged to a little girl who vanished without a trace. Nearby, a tarnished knife was displayed alongside a note that read, "This blade was last held by Edward Hale, who confessed to a murder he never committed." A painting hung on the far wall, its colors muted and its subject, a stormy field, strangely alive. Alyssa swore the clouds and the painting moved when she blinked. Tom was drawn to a pocket watch, its surface blackened as though scorched by fire. Jenna lingered near the painting, her expression unreadable. Mark, however, was fixated on a silver locket. It was small and unassuming, its surface engraved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when the light hit them. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Alyssa noticed Mr. Elric watching Mark with a peculiar intensity. When he caught her gaze, his smile widened. "Every artifact has a story," he said. "Some, however, carry their stories with them, forever." The tour continued, each room more unsettling than the last. Alyssa's discomfort grew with every step, but the others seemed oblivious, marveling at the museum's macabre collection. By the time they reached the final gallery, she was ready to leave. Mr. Elric escorted them back to the lobby, where he bid them farewell with a small bow. "Do come again," he said, his tone dripping with something that wasn't quite sincerity. As they stepped outside, the mist had thickened, shrouding the town in an oppressive gray. The museum door closed behind them with a heavy thud, and Alyssa felt as though they had left something behind, or perhaps taken something with them. She didn't notice Mark slipping the locket into his pocket. The ride back to their motel was unusually quiet. The once light-hearted banter among the friends was replaced by a thick, unspoken tension. Tom drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, while Jenna stared out the window, her reflection in the glass pale and distorted by the fog. Alyssa, seated in the back with Mark, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He was hunched over, staring intently at something in his lap. "What's that?" she asked. Mark jolted, quickly stuffing whatever he was holding into his jacket pocket. "Nothing," he said too quickly. Alyssa frowned. "It didn't look like nothing. It's just a little souvenir," he muttered, turning away from her. "Don't make a big deal out of it." Alyssa wanted to press him further, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't just defensiveness, it was fear. By the time they reached the motel, night had fallen. The small roadside inn was as unremarkable as the rest of the town. Peeling paint, flickering neon sign, and a faint smell of mildew that clung to the air. Their room was cramped but serviceable, with 2 double beds, a battered coffee table, and a tiny TV mounted in the corner. Jenna immediately claimed the bathroom, leaving the others to unpack. Tom cracked open a beer and collapsed onto one of the beds. "All right, who's up for some cards?" he asked, trying to inject some levity into the evening. Alyssa shook her head. "I think I'm just going to turn in early." "Lame," Tom teased, but there was no real bite in his words. He seemed just as tired as she felt. Alyssa lay down on the other bed, pulling the scratchy motel blanket up to her chin. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Her thoughts kept returning to the museum, to the curator, to the artifacts, to the way Mark had been acting ever since they left. She opened her eyes just in time to see him sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling the locket out of his pocket. "Mark, what are you doing?" she whispered. He didn't respond. The locket dangled from its chain, catching the dim light of the bedside lamp. Alyssa couldn't explain it, but something about the way it moved made her stomach twist. It wasn't just swinging back and forth. It was spinning, the patterns on its surface shifting like liquid metal. "Mark," she said again, louder this time. He turned to look at her, and for a moment, she didn't recognize him. His eyes were dark and hollow, and his face was pale as death. Then he blinked, and the moment passed. He slipped the locket back into his pocket and muttered, "Go to sleep, Alyssa." That night, Alyssa dreamed of the museum. She was walking through its darkened halls, the shadows of the artifacts stretching toward her like skeletal fingers. She stopped in front of the painting Jenna had admired. Only now the stormy field wasn't empty. A figure stood in the distance, shrouded in mist. It turned toward her, and she woke with a start. The room was pitch black, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioner. For a moment, she thought she was alone, until she heard it. A whisper, faint and unintelligible, like the rustling of dry leaves. She froze, straining to hear. The sound was coming from Mark's bed. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. She held her breath, waiting for him to respond, but he didn't. Slowly, she sat up, reaching for the lamp on the bedside table. The light flickered to life, and she gasped. Mark was sitting upright, his eyes wide and unblinking. The locket dangled from his hand, its chain wrapped tightly around his fingers. His lips moved soundlessly, as though he were speaking to someone she couldn't see. "Mark," she said louder this time. He blinked, his expression shifting from blankness to confusion. What's wrong?" "You were talking," Alyssa said, her voice shaking. "To the locket." Mark frowned, looking down at the object in his hand. "I wasn't talking to it," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. He glanced around the room, as though expecting to see someone standing there. I don't know what's happening." The others woke up then, groggily asking what all the commotion was about. Alyssa tried to explain, but Mark waved her off. "It was just a nightmare," he said, forcing a laugh. "You're overreacting." But Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that had followed them from the museum. Over the next day, Mark grew increasingly withdrawn. He barely spoke, his attention focused entirely on the locket. At first, the others joked about it, calling him Gollum and teasing him about his new precious. But as the hours passed, their laughter faded. Something about Mark's obsession was deeply unsettling. Jenna was the first to confront him. "You need to put that thing away," she said, snatching the locket from his hands. Mark's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged at her, his face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Alyssa thought he might actually hit her. But then he stopped, his body going rigid. "It's mine," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and guttural. Jenna stared at him in shock before throwing the locket onto the bed. Mark snatched it up, cradling it in his hands like a wounded animal. That night, the whispering returned. This time, Alyssa wasn't the only one who heard it. Tom woke up first, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Jenna nodded, clutching her blanket like a lifeline. "It's coming from him." They turned to look at Mark, who was lying on his back, the locket resting on his chest. His lips moved soundlessly, the whispers spilling from his mouth like poison. Alyssa reached out to shake him awake, but the moment her hand touched his shoulder, his eyes snapped open. They weren't his eyes. They were black, empty voids, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she saw something staring out at her. Something ancient and malevolent. Then Mark screamed. Mark's scream shattered the silence, waking the entire motel. His body convulsed on the bed, as if something unseen was pulling at him, tearing him apart from the inside. The locket glowed faintly in the dim room, its strange patterns writhing as though alive. Alyssa and Jenna jumped back in terror, while Tom grabbed Mark by the shoulders, trying to hold him still. "Mark, snap out of it," Tom shouted, his voice trembling. But Mark didn't respond. His screams turned into guttural growls, and for a moment, his face seemed to change. Alyssa swore she saw his features twist into something unnatural, his jaw unnaturally elongated, his eyes hollow black pits. The glow of the locket intensified, filling the room with a sickly, greenish light. Then, as suddenly as it started, the convulsion stopped. Mark fell limp, his breathing shallow but steady. The locket went dark, its surface once again dull and lifeless. Tom looked up at Alyssa, his face pale. What the hell was that? Alyssa couldn't find the words. She stared at the locket, now lying on Mark's chest, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. The next morning, Mark was quiet, his movements slow and deliberate. He claimed to remember nothing of the night before, but his haunted expression told a different story. Alyssa noticed that his hands trembled when he picked up his coffee cup, and he flinched at the slightest noise. The group decided to leave Ashwick as soon as possible, but strange things began to happen the moment they hit the road. The GPS on Tom's phone malfunctioned, the screen flickering and showing nonsensical directions. The dense fog that had surrounded the town the previous day seemed to have thickened, turning the road into a swirling maze of gray. No matter how far they drove, they couldn't seem to leave the area. "I swear we passed that sign already," Jenna said, her voice rising in panic. She pointed to a rusted road marker on the side of the road, its lettering barely legible. "That's the third time I've seen it." Tom tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. "It's just the fog messing with us. We'll find our way out." But Alyssa wasn't so sure. She glanced at Mark, who was sitting in the back seat with the locket clutched tightly in his hands. He hadn't said a word since they left the motel, his eyes fixed on the swirling patterns of the pendant. "What's wrong with him?" Jenna whispered to Alyssa, leaning in close so Mark wouldn't hear. "He's acting different." Alyssa didn't answer. She was too focused on the whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but she could hear them. Soft, insidious voices weaving through the air, speaking words she couldn't understand. The sound seemed to be coming from the locket. As the day dragged on, the fog grew thicker, turning the landscape into a featureless void. Tom pulled over to the side of the road, cursing under his breath. "This is useless. We're just going in circles." Jenna got out of the car, pacing anxiously. "We need to do something. Maybe we should go back to the museum, find that creepy curator. He might know what's going on." "No," Mark said suddenly, his voice cold and firm. Everyone turned to look at him. It was the first thing he had said all day. "We're not going back." Alyssa felt a chill run down her spine. "Mark, we're lost. If he can help us." "He can't," Mark snapped, his eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. "The locket, it's protecting us. Going back would make things worse." Before anyone could respond, a low growl echoed through the fog. It was deep and guttural, like the sound of a predator stalking its prey. Tom stepped out of the car, peering into the mist. "Did you hear that?" Jenna grabbed his arm. "Don't. Just stay here." But Tom ignored her, taking a cautious step toward the sound. The growl came again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps. Alyssa's heart pounded as a shadowy figure emerged from the fog. It was tall and skeletal, its long limbs twisting unnaturally as it moved. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, the same light that had emanated from the locket. "Get back in the car!" Alyssa shouted, but it was too late. The figure lunged toward Tom, moving with terrifying speed. He barely managed to scramble out of the way, falling to the ground as the creature slammed into the side of the car, denting the metal with a deafening crash. Jenna screamed, pulling Tom to his feet. The group piled back into the car, slamming the doors just as the creature lunged again. Its claws scraped against the windows, leaving deep gouges in the glass. "Drive!" Jenna shouted, her voice hysterical. Tom didn't need to be told twice. He threw the car into gear and sped off, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The creature chased them, its elongated limbs propelling it forward with unnatural speed. The whispers in the air grew louder, forming a cacophony that drowned out everything else. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It stood motionless in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes fixed on the car as it disappeared into the fog. They didn't stop driving until the fog began to thin, revealing a desolate stretch of highway surrounded by dense forest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. The group was silent, their faces pale and drawn. Mark was the first to speak. "It won't stop," he said, his voice hollow. "It'll keep coming until it gets what it wants." "What does it want?" Alyssa asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Mark looked down at the locket, his fingers tracing its intricate patterns. "Me," he said. "It wants me." The car sped down the empty highway, its tires humming against the asphalt. No one spoke for what felt like hours. Alyssa sat with her arms crossed, her mind racing as she replayed the events of the past day. The museum, the whispers, the figure in the fog, it all seemed unreal. But the locket was very real, as was the terror etched into Mark's face. He sat in the back seat, clutching the pendant so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Finally, Jenna broke the silence. "We can't just keep driving," she said, her voice shaky. "We need a plan." Tom gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "What kind of plan? We don't even know what's happening." Alyssa turned to look at Mark. "You do, don't you?" she asked softly. "You've been acting strange ever since you took that thing. What aren't you telling us?" Mark didn't respond at first. His eyes were fixed on the locket, his lips moving soundlessly as if reciting a prayer. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of despair. "It's alive," he said. "The locket, it speaks to me. It's been speaking to me since I took it. What does it say? Jenna demanded. Mark hesitated, his gaze flickering to the others before returning to the pendant. It tells me things, secrets, promises. It says it can give me power, wealth, anything I want. But there's a price. Tom let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, no kidding. That thing nearly got us killed. Mark shook his head. It's not the locket itself. It's what's inside it. Something ancient. It's bound to the locket, and now it's bound to me. The group decided to stop at a small diner they found on the side of the road. It was nearly deserted, the few patrons casting wary glances at the four disheveled strangers who stumbled inside. They chose a booth in the corner, far from prying eyes, and leaned in close to talk. "We need to get rid of it," Alyssa said, her voice firm. "Whatever that thing is, it's dangerous. We have to destroy it." Mark flinched at her words, his hand instinctively covering the locket. "You don't understand. It won't let me go." Jenna sighed, her head in her hands. "Then we take it back to the museum. Let the creepy curator deal with it." Mark's face darkened. "No, going back would only make things worse." Tom slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone. "Enough with the cryptic crap, Mark. If you know something, tell us." Mark's hands trembled as he held the locket up for them to see. "This isn't the first time it's been taken. The curator didn't put it there to display it. He put it there to trap it. The locket needs a host, and now that it's chosen me, I'm the only one who can stop it." Alyssa frowned. "What do you mean, stop it?" Mark swallowed hard. "It needs a sacrifice. If I give it what it wants, it'll leave the rest of you alone." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alyssa felt a chill crawl down her spine. "You can't be serious," she said. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Mark said, his voice flat. "It's been telling me that since last night. Either I give it what it wants, or it'll take all of us." Jenna shook her head vehemently. "No, we're not letting you do that." Tom looked torn, his jaw clenching as he struggled to think of an alternative. "What if we destroy it? Burn it? Smash it? Whatever it takes?" Mark let out a hollow laugh. "You think I haven't tried? I can't even take it off." He tugged at the chain around his neck, but the locket didn't budge. "It's fused to me. The only way to end this is to give it what it wants." "And what does it want?" Alyssa asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Mark's eyes met hers, and she saw the pain in them. "It wants blood." Despite their protests, Mark insisted they return to the museum. "It's the only place where this can end," he said. "If I die, it'll stop. But it has to be there. That's where it was bound before, and that's where it has to be bound again." The drive back to Ashwick was suffocatingly tense. No one spoke, the weight of Mark's decision pressing down on them like a physical force. The fog returned as they neared the town, thicker than before, swallowing the road and the trees in its ghostly embrace. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the car with a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. "Do you hear that?" Jenna whispered, clutching Alyssa's arm. Alyssa nodded, her heart pounding. The whispers seemed to be coming from all directions, seeping into her mind like poison. She glanced at Mark, who was sitting unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The locket glowed faintly against his chest, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. When they finally reached Ashwick, the town was unrecognizable. The cobblestone streets were cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered. The museum stood at the center of it all, its polished facade untouched by the decay that surrounded it. "This is it," Mark said, his voice distant. "This is where it ends." Inside the museum, the air was colder than ever, thick with the scent of mildew and rot. The curator was waiting for them, his skeletal frame silhouetted against the dim light of the lobby. His smile was as sharp as Alyssa remembered. "Welcome back," he said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "I see you've brought my artifact with you." Mark stepped forward, the locket glowing brighter with each step. "You knew this would happen," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You knew it would choose me." The curator tilted his head, his smile widening. "Of course. The locket always chooses the strongest will. And you, my dear boy, have a most remarkable strength." "Tell me how to stop it," Mark demanded. Tell me how to end this." The curator's eyes gleamed. "You already know the answer. The locket demands a sacrifice, and it will not be denied. But take comfort. Your death will not be in vain. You will become part of its story, a tale to be told for generations to come." Mark turned to the others, his face pale but resolute. "Stay back. No matter what happens, don't interfere." "Mark, don't do this," Alyssa pleaded, tears streaming down her face. But he didn't listen. He walked into the heart of the museum, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The last thing Alyssa saw before the locket's light consumed him was the look of quiet acceptance on his face. The blinding green light filled the museum, its radiance searing into Alyssa's vision. She shielded her eyes, but the whispers only grew louder, their words twisting in her mind like a cruel melody. Then, as abruptly as it started, the light vanished, plunging the room into silence. When Alyssa opened her eyes, Mark was gone. "Mark," she called out, her voice trembling. Her gaze darted around the room, but there was no sign of him. Only the locket, now lying in the center of the floor. It no longer glowed, its surface dull and inert. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the museum itself was holding its breath. Jenna was the first to break the silence. "Where is he? What happened to him?" The curator stepped forward, his footsteps eerily quiet against the polished wood. He bent down and picked up the locket, cradling it in his bony hands like a prized possession. "He has fulfilled his purpose," he said, his tone almost reverent. "The locket is satisfied for now." "What the hell does that mean?" Tom demanded, stepping toward the curator. "Where is Mark?" The curator's sharp smile returned. "He is part of the locket now, part of its story, as are all who have borne its burden. Their sacrifice binds the entity within, keeping it dormant, until the next host is chosen." Jenna shook her head, backing away. "No, this can't be happening. We didn't agree to this." "Your agreement was never required," the curator said calmly. "The locket chooses, and the chosen have no say in their fate." Alyssa felt a surge of anger rise within her. "You knew this would happen," she said, her voice shaking. "You let us walk into this trap." The curator's expression softened, though it only made him look more grotesque. "It is not a trap, my dear. It is a necessity. The entity must be contained, and the locket requires a host to maintain the balance. Mark was chosen because he was strong enough to endure the burden. Few are." The curator gestured for them to follow him, leading them deeper into the museum. Reluctantly, they trailed behind, too stunned and horrified to resist. He brought them to a vast gallery filled with rows of glass cases. Inside each case was an artifact, a locket, a doll, a knife, a ring, all of them radiating an unsettling energy. "These are the bindings," the curator explained. "Each one contains a fragment of something ancient and dangerous. Without these sacrifices, the world would be overrun by forces far beyond your comprehension." Alyssa stared at the cases, her stomach churning. "So, you're saying this museum is some kind of prison?" The curator nodded. "Precisely. Every artifact tells a story, as I said before. But those stories are not mere tales. They are the essence of the entities within. The locket you encountered holds one of the oldest and most insidious among them. Its hunger is unending, and its whispers can drive even the strongest to madness." "And Mark?" Jenna asked, her voice cracking. "He's just gone?" "Not gone," the curator said. "His essence is bound to the locket. His sacrifice ensures the entity remains contained. He will be remembered as part of its story, immortalized in its curse." Tom clenched his fists, his face red with anger. "You make it sound like he's some kind of hero. He didn't ask for this. None of us did." The curator's smile faded. "Few heroes are given a choice." As the curator spoke, Alyssa felt a strange pull toward one of the glass cases. It contained a small, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished. She approached it slowly, her reflection distorted and fragmented in the broken glass. For a moment, she thought she saw Mark's face staring back at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "What are you doing?" Jenna asked, grabbing her arm. "Don't go near it." Alyssa shook her head. I think he's still here. Tom groaned in frustration. Don't start with that. Mark's gone. You heard the creepy old guy. No, Elise insisted. I saw him. In the mirror. He's trying to tell us something. The curator stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Alyssa. You are perceptive, he said, his voice tinged with approval. The bindings leave echoes of their hosts. A fragment of Mark's essence lingers, tied to the locket. But do not mistake this for salvation. What remains of him is but a shadow, a memory. Alyssa turned to face him, her eyes blazing with determination. Then let me see him. Let me talk to him. The curator hesitated, his expression unreadable. That is not advisable. The echoes are not stable. They may show you the truth, or they may consume you. I don't care, Alyssa said. I need to know if he's still in there. Reluctantly, the curator led Alyssa to a secluded room at the back of the museum. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces shimmering like liquid silver. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal upon which rested the locket. It glowed faintly, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. Touch it, the curator instructed. But be warned, what you see may not be what you expect. Alyssa hesitated, her hand hovering over the locket. She could feel its energy, cold and electric, radiating from its surface. Taking a deep breath, she pressed her fingers against the metal. The world around her shifted. She was no longer in the museum. She stood in a vast, empty void, the ground beneath her feet a swirling mass of shadows. In the distance, she saw Mark, his figure flickering like a dying flame. She ran toward him, her heart pounding. Mark, she called out. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with despair. Alyssa, what are you doing here? I came to find you, she said. I couldn't just leave you. Mark shook his head. You shouldn't be here. It's not safe. I don't care, she said, tears streaming down her face. I'm not leaving without you. Mark reached out to her, but his hand passed through hers like smoke. You can't save me, he said. I'm part of it now. You have to let me go. No, Alyssa said firmly. There has to be a way. Tell me how to free you. Before Mark could answer, the shadows around them began to writhe, coiling like serpents. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the void. You do not belong here. The entity emerged from the darkness, its form monstrous and shifting, its eyes burning with malevolent light. Alyssa froze, paralyzed by its presence. Run, Mark whispered. Get out of here before it's too late. But Alyssa couldn't move. The entity loomed closer, its whispers filling her mind. Just as it reached for her, the curator's voice broke through the chaos. Release her. The void shattered, and Alyssa found herself back in the museum, gasping for breath. The locket lay dormant on the pedestal, its glow extinguished. Alyssa stumbled backward, her legs trembling as the curator stepped forward, his pale face unreadable. Tom and Jenna rushed into the room, their frantic voices breaking through the haze, clouding her thoughts. What happened? Are you okay? Jenna asked, grabbing Alyssa by the shoulders. Alyssa nodded weakly, her eyes darting to the locket. Mark, he's in there. He's still in there. I saw him. Tom let out a bitter laugh. And what does that mean? Are we supposed to just leave him trapped in that thing forever? The curator placed a hand on the locket, his touch almost reverent. His essence is bound to it now, part of its eternal story. To attempt to free him would only risk unleashing the entity. His sacrifice has sealed it. Any disruption could bring catastrophe. Alyssa's fists clenched at her sides. There has to be another way. The curator shook his head. There is no other way. The bindings are delicate, and the balance must be preserved. Interfering could destroy not only Mark, but all of you as well. But Alyssa wasn't listening. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of what Mark had said, what the whispers had revealed. The entity fed on sacrifice, on the energy of those who bore its curse. But what if that connection could be severed? What if the locket itself could be destroyed? She turned to the curator, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. If the locket is destroyed, what happens to the entity? The curator's expression darkened. You misunderstand its nature. The locket is not merely a vessel. It is a tether. To destroy, it would unbind the entity completely, releasing it into this world. You cannot begin to comprehend the destruction it would bring. Alyssa's gaze fell to the locket, its dull surface almost mocking her. She could still feel Mark's presence, faint but undeniable. She couldn't abandon him, not like this. But the risk, the weight of it pressed down on her like a crushing wave. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked quietly. "Do we just leave him here, forgotten, while that thing waits for its next victim?" The curator hesitated, his sharp features softening for the first time. "There is one alternative," he said, "but it is not without cost." The curator stepped aside, his bony hand gesturing toward the pedestal. "The locket requires a host. If another willingly takes its place, the entity will remain bound, and Mark's essence may find rest." Jenna's eyes widened in horror. "You're saying someone has to take it?" "No way. That's insane." Tom shook his head, his voice rising. "There's no way we're letting any of us do that. There's got to be another option." But Alyssa stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She ignored Jenna's protests and Tom's curses, her focus solely on the locket. Mark's face, his voice, his final plea, they were all burned into her mind. He had saved them, sacrificed himself to protect them. Now it was her turn. "I'll do it," she said. Jenna grabbed her arm, tears streaming down her face. "You can, Alyssa. You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Alyssa said, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her gut. "Mark gave everything for us. I can't just walk away and leave him like this." Tom stepped in front of her, his expression desperate. "This isn't the answer, Alyssa. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," she said, her voice breaking. "You heard him. The locket needs someone. If I don't do this, it'll only find someone else." The curator inclined his head, a faint hint of approval in his cold eyes. "Your resolve is admirable. Few have the courage to make such a choice." Alyssa reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the locket. The metal was ice cold, and the moment she touched it, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They clawed at her mind, promising power, knowledge, freedom, if only she would surrender. "I'm ready," she whispered. The curator began to chant, his voice a low, guttural hum that resonated through the room. The air grew thick, oppressive, as the locket's light flickered to life. Alyssa felt its energy coursing through her, cold and invasive, wrapping around her like tendrils of smoke. Pain shot through her body, sharp and searing. She clenched her teeth, refusing to cry out, even as the whispers intensified, drilling into her mind. Images flashed before her eyes. Mark's face, the figure in the fog, the endless void where the entity dwelled. Then suddenly it stopped. The room fell silent, the locket's light fading once more. Alyssa collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The locket now rested around her neck, its weight heavy against her chest. She could feel its presence, an alien consciousness brushing against her own. But it was subdued, its hunger momentarily sated. "Alyssa," Jenna's voice was hesitant, filled with both fear and hope. Alyssa looked up, her vision blurry but clear enough to see their faces. She forced a weak smile. "I'm okay." As she stood, a faint voice echoed in her mind. "Alyssa." Her heart skipped a beat. "Mark." "Thank you," the voice whispered, filled with a bittersweet mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "You saved them. You saved me." Tears streamed down her face as his presence faded, leaving her alone with the entity. She could feel its cold anger simmering beneath the surface, but for now, it was contained. "You are bound now," the curator said, his tone almost gentle. "You carry a great burden, but you have also ensured the safety of countless others. For that, you have my respect." Alyssa nodded, too exhausted to respond. She turned to her friends, their faces pale and grief-stricken. "Go," she said. "Get out of here. Live your lives. Don't let this place haunt you." Jenna shook her head, her voice breaking. "We can't just leave you. You have to," Alyssa said firmly. "This is my choice, my responsibility." Tom hesitated, his fists clenched, but he finally nodded. "We'll never forget you," he said. As her friends walked away, Alyssa felt a strange sense of peace. The locket's weight was crushing, its whispers relentless, but she had made her choice. She would bear the burden, just as Mark had. Years later, a new group of travelers stumbled upon the Ashwick Museum of Curiosities. The curator greeted them with his usual sharp smile, leading them into the gallery to marvel at the strange and unsettling artifacts. In the center of the collection, displayed under a single spotlight, was a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a determined expression. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "Alyssa Harper, the Guardian. Her sacrifice binds the locket, preserving the fragile balance between light and darkness. May her strength never be forgotten." The locket remained dormant, waiting, and Alyssa, somewhere deep within its shadows, watched over it, ensuring its curse could harm no one else. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.